Welcome to the Unseen Shelf. As the series of the World War, we will talk about the Second World War. Today's book is The Coming of the Third Reich by Richard J. Evans. This book explores how Germany transitioned from a fragile democracy to a totalitarian Nazi dictatorship. The book traces this transformation chronologically, examining the failure of the Weimar Republic, the economic devastation of the Great Depression, the rise of political extremism, the strategic growth of the Nazi Party, and Adolf Hitler's eventual consolidation of power. Evans argues that the Nazi regime did not simply seize power by force, but rather gained control as German society gradually adapted to and aligned itself with Nazi ideology. Following Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in 1933, key events such as the Reichstag fire and the passing of the Enabling Act dismantled democracy from within, allowing the Nazis to establish an authoritarian state through legal and institutional means. More than just a historical account, the coming of the Third Reich serves as a stark warning about how democracy can erode from within, offering a profound analysis of the societal and political conditions that made such a transformation possible. Let's get started.
Part 1. The Legacy of the Past. Chapter 1. The Idea of Germany and the German Idea. The roots of the Third Reich stretch deep into Germany's past, long before the rise of the Nazi Party. In this opening chapter, Evans examines how German nationalism, militarism, and authoritarian traditions shaped the ideological foundations upon which the Nazis would later build their regime. For much of its history, Germany had been a fragmented collection of states rather than a unified nation. The unification of Germany in 1871, orchestrated by Otto von Bismarck, was achieved not through democratic means, but through warfare and political maneuvering. The newly unified German Empire was dominated by Prussian militarism, an ideology that glorified discipline, hierarchy, and obedience to the state. This deeply ingrained militaristic culture would later prove instrumental in facilitating the rise of Nazi totalitarianism. Furthermore, Germany's political structure under the Kaiserreich, 1871 to 1918, was far from democratic. While the Reichstag, parliament, existed, real power was concentrated in the hands of the Kaiser and his appointed officials. The German people were accustomed to a strong, centralized authority, making them susceptible to leadership that promised order and national strength. This lack of democratic tradition contributed to the instability of the Weimar Republic and created fertile ground for extremist movements like Nazism. Additionally, Evans highlights how romantic nationalism played a crucial role in shaping German identity. Thinkers like Johann Gottfried Herder and Johann Fichte had promoted the idea of a uniquely German Volksgemeinschaft, people's community, emphasizing cultural and racial unity. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this concept evolved into an exclusionary form of nationalism that vilified outsiders, particularly Jews, as threats to national purity. These ideas would later be weaponized by the Nazis to justify racial policies and expansionist ambitions. Thus, Germany's historical trajectory, its militaristic traditions, authoritarian governance, and exclusionary nationalism provided the ideological blueprint for the Third Reich. Nazism did not emerge in a vacuum. Rather, it was an extreme manifestation of long-standing currents in German political and cultural history. Chapter 2. The Legacy of the Great War. The First World War, 1914 to 1918, was not just a military catastrophe for Germany. It was a profound psychological and political rupture that set the stage for the rise of the Nazi movement. In this chapter, Evans explores how the war's outcome shattered German society, fueling the resentment, radicalization, and desire for retribution that the Nazis would later exploit. Germany's defeat in 1918 was unexpected and devastating. Until the final months of the war, the German public had been led to believe that victory was within reach. The sudden collapse of the German military and the subsequent abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II in November 1918 left the nation in shock. Many Germans struggled to accept that their powerful empire had been defeated, leading to the widespread belief in the stab in the back, Dolchstoßlegende myth, the false notion that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield, but had been betrayed by internal enemies, particularly Jews, socialists, and communists. This conspiracy theory, widely propagated by right-wing nationalists, eroded trust in democratic institutions and provided a foundation for Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda. Adding to the humiliation was the Treaty of Versailles, 1919, which imposed severe territorial losses, military restrictions, and economic reparations on Germany. Evans emphasizes that while these terms were not as harsh as later Nazi propaganda claimed, they were deeply resented by the German population. The treaty not only stripped Germany of its colonies and reduced its army to a fraction of its former size, but also held Germany solely responsible for the war through the infamous Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. This perceived injustice fueled nationalist grievances and intensified the desire for political revenge, sentiments that Hitler would later exploit to rally support. The economic consequences of the war and the Versailles Treaty were equally destabilizing. Germany faced crippling hyperinflation in 1923, plunging the middle class into economic despair. Evans describes how families saw their life savings rendered worthless almost overnight, creating widespread disillusionment with the Weimar Republic. For many, democracy became associated with economic chaos and national humiliation, making radical alternatives more appealing. In the aftermath of World War I, German politics became increasingly polarized. The Weimar Republic, established in 1919, struggled to maintain stability amid constant threats from both the extreme left, communists, and the extreme right, nationalists and paramilitaries. Violence in the streets became commonplace, and right-wing paramilitary groups, such as the Freikorps, carried out assassinations and uprisings against the government. The Nazis, still a fringe movement in the early 1920s, found fertile ground in this volatile political environment, using the legacy of the Great War to present themselves as the true defenders of German honor and national restoration. Thus, Evans argues that the wounds inflicted by the First World War, military defeat, economic hardship, national humiliation, and political instability created the conditions necessary for the rise of Nazism. The war did not automatically lead to Hitler's dictatorship, but it provided the raw material from which the Nazi movement would later construct its narrative of betrayal, victimhood, and revenge. Part 2, The Failure of Democracy. Chapter 3, The Weaknesses of Weimar. The collapse of the Weimar Republic was not an inevitable outcome, but as Evans illustrates, the young democracy was riddled with structural weaknesses from the outset. Established in 1919 following Germany's defeat in World War I, the Republic represented the country's first experiment with democracy. However, it was born in an atmosphere of deep political instability, economic turmoil, and widespread resentment over the Treaty of Versailles. Many Germans, particularly conservatives and nationalists, never fully accepted the new system, seeing it as an artificial imposition by the victorious Allied powers rather than an organic expression of German political will. One of the fundamental weaknesses of the Weimar system was its flawed constitutional design. The Weimar Constitution included a provision, Article 48, which allowed the president to rule by decree in times of emergency, bypassing the Reichstag, parliament. While intended as a safeguard against crises, this provision ultimately became a tool for authoritarian rule, as successive governments relied increasingly on emergency measures rather than democratic consensus. The structure of the political system also enabled extreme fragmentation. Germany's system of proportional representation meant that no single party could achieve a majority, resulting in unstable coalition governments that struggled to pass meaningful reforms. Furthermore, Weimar democracy faced hostility from both the far left and far right. The left-wing Spartacist uprising of 1919, led by communist revolutionaries, was brutally crushed by right-wing paramilitary groups known as the Freikorps, who themselves harbored deep anti-democratic tendencies. These same Freikorps veterans later formed the backbone of the Nazi movement. Meanwhile, conservative elites, including the military, judiciary, and business leaders, remained skeptical of democracy and often undermined it. Many judges, for instance, were far more lenient towards right-wing extremists than left-wing revolutionaries, reflecting the deep institutional biases against the Republic. Economic instability further eroded confidence in the Weimar government. By 1923, Germany experienced one of the worst cases of hyperinflation in history, with prices skyrocketing to the point where the German mark became almost worthless. Ordinary citizens, particularly the middle class, saw their savings wiped out overnight. While the economy temporarily stabilized in the mid-1920s with the help of American loans under the Dawes Plan, the fragility of this recovery was exposed when the Great Depression struck in 1929. Most critically, Evans argues that many Germans did not culturally embrace democracy. Having been accustomed to authoritarian rule under the Kaiserreich, large segments of the population viewed parliamentary democracy as weak and inefficient. The growing support for extreme parties, whether the communists on the left or the Nazis on the right, reflected a broad disillusionment with the political status quo. The failure of moderate democratic parties to inspire confidence left the political arena increasingly dominated by radical forces, paving the way for Hitler's rise. Chapter 4: The Crisis of Capitalism. The global economic collapse of 1929 dealt the final blow to Germany's fragile democracy. The Great Depression, triggered by the Wall Street crash, sent shockwaves across the world, but few countries suffered as much as Germany. The economic recovery of the mid-1920s had been largely built on American loans and foreign investment, and when the U.S. economy collapsed, these financial lifelines were abruptly cut off. German banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment skyrocketed from 1.3 million in 1929 to over 6 million by 1932. Evans highlights how the economic devastation radicalized the German electorate. The middle class, already traumatized by the hyperinflation crisis of 1923, now faced total economic ruin. The working class, suffering from mass unemployment, turned increasingly to the Communist Party, KPD, while the middle and upper classes, fearing a Bolshevik-style revolution, shifted their support toward the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, or Nazi Party. The Nazis exploited the crisis masterfully. Hitler and his propaganda chief, Joseph Goebbels, framed the economic collapse as proof of Weimar democracy's incompetence and the need for strong, decisive leadership. Nazi rhetoric emphasized national unity, economic revival, and scapegoating of Jews, socialists, and traitors as the cause of Germany's suffering. Hitler's speeches promised jobs, stability, and an end to the humiliations of the Versailles Treaty. Meanwhile, Germany's conservative elites, desperate to contain the growing influence of the communists, began to view the Nazis as a useful tool. Business leaders, military officials, and right-wing politicians believed they could control Hitler and use his popular support to push their own agenda, restoring authoritarian rule without fully embracing Nazi extremism. In 1932, key figures like Franz von Papen and President Paul von Hindenburg facilitated Hitler's rise, believing that once in power, he could be reined in. However, as Evans makes clear, this was a catastrophic miscalculation. Hitler was not a traditional politician who could be managed. He was a revolutionary determined to dismantle democracy from within. Once appointed chancellor in January 1933, he wasted no time in consolidating power, using a combination of legal measures and outright terror to eliminate opposition. Thus, Evans argues that the Great Depression was the single most decisive factor in Hitler's rise. Without the economic collapse, the Nazi Party might have remained a fringe movement, confined to the radical right. But as desperation replaced hope and fear replaced faith in democracy, Germans turned to the extremes, allowing Hitler to exploit the crisis and seize power. Part 3: The Rise of Nazism. Chapter 5: The Appeal of Nazism. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, the Nazi Party had transformed from a small fringe movement into a dominant political force in Germany. Evans delves into how the Nazis, through a combination of propaganda, mass mobilization, and strategic messaging, were able to attract millions of Germans across different social classes and ideological backgrounds. At the heart of the Nazi movement was Adolf Hitler's unparalleled ability as a public speaker. His speeches were fiery, theatrical, and deeply emotive, resonating with audiences who were desperate for stability, national pride, and economic recovery. He skillfully adapted his rhetoric to different crowds, promising the working-class jobs and an end to economic despair, assuring the middle class of protection from communism, and appealing to conservative elites by emphasizing law and order. But Hitler alone could not have propelled the Nazis to power. Their propaganda machine, orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels, was one of the most sophisticated in political history. The Nazis used modern marketing techniques, radio broadcasts, mass rallies, posters, and films to craft an image of Hitler as Germany's destined savior. Evans notes how Nazi messaging emphasized three core themes. First, anti-Semitism. The Jews were scapegoated for Germany's economic troubles, the Versailles Treaty, and the supposed moral decay of German society. Second, anti-communism. The Nazis portrayed themselves as the only force capable of saving Germany from a Bolshevik revolution, exploiting fears of Soviet-style communism. Third, nationalism and militarism. The promise to restore German greatness, rebuild the military, and defy the Versailles Treaty appealed to many who felt humiliated by World War I's outcome. Evans also highlights how the Nazis presented themselves as a broad-based people's movement, Volksbewegung, rather than a traditional political party. Unlike their rivals, they combined radical ideology with mass appeal, drawing support from both the working class and conservative nationalists. They used paramilitary groups like the SA, Sturmabteilung, or Brown Shirts, to create an aura of strength and order, while also intimidating political opponents. Importantly, the Nazis positioned themselves as the only alternative to political chaos. With the Weimar Republic mired in economic depression and ineffective governance, many Germans became disillusioned with democracy. By 1932, the Nazi Party had emerged as the largest in the Reichstag, not because all voters embraced their ideology, but because they seemed to offer stability, direction, and national unity in a time of crisis. Chapter 6. The Fall of Democracy. The final years of the Weimar Republic were marked by political paralysis, street violence, and a desperate search for leadership. Evans describes how, from 1932 to early 1933, German democracy crumbled as conservative elites made a fatal mistake, believing they could use Hitler for their own ends while keeping him under control. By 1932, the Nazi Party had become the most powerful force in German politics. Yet Hitler still did not hold official power. President Paul von Hindenburg, a revered but aging war hero, was reluctant to appoint Hitler as chancellor. Instead, Germany cycled through weak governments led by Heinrich Brüning, Franz von Papen, and Kurt von Schleicher, none of whom could command lasting support. Each chancellor relied increasingly on Article 48, ruling by emergency decree, rather than parliamentary consensus, further eroding democracy. Hitler's rise was not inevitable. It was enabled by the miscalculations of conservative elites who believed they could manipulate him. Franz von Papen, a staunch Catholic conservative, sought to bring Hitler into government to harness his mass appeal while sidelining his radical elements. In January 1933, after months of negotiations and political backstabbing, Hindenburg was persuaded to appoint Hitler as chancellor, with Papen as vice-chancellor, believing this arrangement would allow them to control him. Evans underscores the colossal misjudgment behind this decision. The assumption was that Hitler, once in office, would be constrained by institutional structures and more experienced politicians. Instead, within weeks, Hitler exploited his position to systematically dismantle democracy from within. The turning point came with the Reichstag fire on February 27, 1933, which the Nazis blamed on communists. This event allowed Hitler to convince Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree, suspending civil liberties and giving the Nazis free rein to arrest political opponents. Shortly afterward, in March 1933, Hitler pushed through the Enabling Act, effectively eliminating parliamentary power and granting him dictatorial authority. What had begun as a tactical alliance between conservatives and Nazis quickly became a full-blown dictatorship. The elites who had sought to control Hitler found themselves sidelined or destroyed as Hitler eliminated rivals, purged opponents, and transformed Germany into a one-party state. Evans makes it clear, Hitler did not seize power through a violent revolution. He was handed it by those who underestimated him. The Weimar Republic did not collapse overnight. Rather, it was eroded step by step. As institutions failed, moderate voices were drowned out, and desperate elites placed their faith in the wrong man. Part 4. Seizing Power. Chapter 7. The Making of the Third Reich. By January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler had been appointed Chancellor of Germany, but his power was far from absolute. The Nazi Party, despite its electoral successes, still faced opposition from political rivals, the press, and key institutions such as the military and the judiciary. The conservative elites who had enabled his rise, including President Paul von Hindenburg and Vice-Chancellor Franz von Papen, believed they could keep him in check. However, as Evans details, Hitler wasted no time in consolidating power and dismantling the remnants of democracy, using both legal means and outright violence. The turning point came just weeks after Hitler took office. On February 27, 1933, the Reichstag building was set on fire, an event that became the catalyst for Germany's transformation into a dictatorship. Though the exact origins of the fire remain debated, the Nazis immediately blamed it on communists, using it as a pretext to eliminate political opposition. The next day, Hitler persuaded Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended civil liberties, including freedom of speech, assembly, and the press. The decree also allowed the police to detain political opponents indefinitely without trial. With these emergency powers, the Nazis launched a brutal crackdown on the Communist Party, KPD, and other left-wing groups. Thousands of communists, socialists, and trade unionists were arrested and sent to hastily established concentration camps. This wave of repression effectively removed one of the Nazis' strongest political adversaries before the upcoming elections. Despite their aggressive tactics, the Nazis still lacked an outright majority in the March 1933 parliamentary elections, securing 43.9% of the vote. However, with their coalition partners, the German National People's Party, DNVP, and by excluding imprisoned communist deputies from parliament, Hitler was able to strengthen his hold on government. Evans highlights how this marked the beginning of the Nazi strategy: eliminate opposition, manipulate legal mechanisms, and use terror to silence dissent. Despite their aggressive tactics, the Nazis still lacked an outright majority in the March 1933 parliamentary elections, securing 43.9% of the vote. However, with their coalition partners, the German National People's Party, DNVP, and by excluding imprisoned communist deputies from parliament, Hitler was able to strengthen his hold on government. Evans highlights how this marked the beginning of the Nazi strategy: eliminate opposition, manipulate legal mechanisms, and use terror to silence dissent. The Reichstag fire decree was only the first step. Hitler understood that to rule unopposed, he needed to dismantle the democratic system entirely. The next move would be the most decisive yet: the passing of the Enabling Act. Chapter 8. The Nazi Revolution. The Enabling Act of March 23, 1933, was the defining moment that transformed Hitler from chancellor into absolute ruler of Germany. Officially titled the Law to Remedy the Distress of People in Reich, this act granted Hitler's government the power to pass laws without Reichstag approval, effectively nullifying the Constitution and eliminating any remaining parliamentary oversight. To ensure the bill's passage, Hitler orchestrated a combination of legal maneuvering, intimidation, and violence. The Communist deputies, KPD, had already been arrested or forced underground, preventing them from voting. Meanwhile, the Social Democratic Party, SPD, was the only remaining opposition, but they were under immense pressure. The vote took place in the Kroll Opera House, heavily surrounded by Nazi paramilitary forces, SA and SS, ensuring that resistance would be futile. With the support of the Center Party, Zentrum, which was pressured into compliance, and the conservative nationalists, the bill passed with a two-thirds majority, 444 votes to 94. The Enabling Act effectively made Hitler a legal dictator, marking the official death of the Weimar Republic. Evans emphasizes that this was not a sudden coup, but a gradual process, where legal institutions were used to destroy democracy from within. With dictatorial powers in hand, Hitler moved swiftly to eradicate political opposition. In May 1933, trade unions were dissolved and replaced with the Nazi-controlled German Labor Front, DAF. By June, the Social Democratic Party, SPD, was banned, and by July, all remaining political parties were outlawed, making Germany a one-party state. Next came the Nazification of state institutions. Evans describes how Hitler purged the civil service, judiciary, and education system, replacing officials with Nazi loyalists. Teachers, professors, and judges were forced to swear allegiance to the regime. The press was brought under state control, ensuring that only Nazi propaganda would reach the public. Censorship and surveillance became routine, with the Gestapo, secret police, systematically eliminating dissent. One of Hitler's biggest challenges came from within his own movement. The SA, Sturmabteilung, the Nazi Party's paramilitary wing, had grown enormously in power and influence under Ernst Röhm. Röhm envisioned the SA as a revolutionary force that would replace the German army, advocating for a second revolution to complete the Nazi takeover. This posed a threat to Hitler's alliance with the Reichswehr, German army, and conservative elites. To neutralize Röhm and consolidate his control, Hitler orchestrated the Night of the Long Knives, June 30th to July 2nd, 1934. In a ruthless purge, SA leaders, along with various political opponents, including conservatives like Kurt von Schleicher, former chancellor, were assassinated. The SS, Schutzstaffel, led by Heinrich Himmler, carried out the killings, proving itself as Hitler's new elite force. This event not only eliminated internal dissent, but also reassured the military, which pledged its loyalty directly to Hitler. By August 2nd, 1934, when President Hindenburg died, Hitler officially merged the offices of Chancellor and President, declaring himself Führer and Reich Chancellor. The German military, once an independent institution, was now required to swear a personal oath of loyalty to Hitler, ensuring that no organized resistance would emerge from within its ranks. At this point, Evans asserts, the Nazi dictatorship was fully realized. The Reichstag had been reduced to a ceremonial body. Opposition parties had been eradicated, free speech and the press were non-existent, and Germany had transformed into a totalitarian state ruled by a single leader with unchecked power. Evans explains that Hitler took power step by step, using laws, fear, and violence. The Reichstag fire, the Enabling Act, and the Night of the Long Knives helped him gain full control. German democracy fell because leaders and institutions underestimated him. They thought they could control him, but he got rid of them instead. With no one left to stop him, Hitler led Germany into war and genocide. Part 5. Establishing Total Control. Chapter 9. Bringing Germany into line. By 1934, Hitler had eliminated his political rivals and secured absolute power, but consolidating Nazi rule required more than just removing opposition. As Evans describes, the next step was to transform every aspect of German society, education, media, law enforcement, and government administration into instruments of Nazi ideology. This process, known as Gleichschaltung, coordination, or bringing into line, ensured that no independent institutions remained that could challenge Hitler's authority. One of the most critical aspects of Gleichschaltung was the purge and restructuring of the civil service. Thousands of government officials, particularly those who were Jewish, left-wing, or not fully loyal to the Nazi cause, were dismissed. The remaining bureaucrats either aligned themselves with the regime or faced removal. The Nazi Party systematically replaced local and state officials with loyalists, ensuring that all levels of governance followed Hitler's directives. Control over education and the media was also a priority. Schools and universities were forced to teach Nazi ideology, rewriting history to glorify German nationalism while demonizing Jews and communists. Teachers were required to join the National Socialist Teachers League, NSLB, and pledge loyalty to Hitler. The press became a tool of propaganda under Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Independent newspapers were shut down, while radio broadcasts and films promoted Nazi values, glorified Hitler, and spread anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Meanwhile, law enforcement and the judiciary were reshaped to serve Nazi goals. The courts, once semi-independent, became tools for punishing political dissent. The traditional police forces were brought under Nazi control, but the most feared instruments of repression were the Gestapo, secret police, and the SS, Schutzstaffel. Led by Heinrich Himmler, the SS became Hitler's most powerful internal security force, operating outside legal constraints. The Gestapo could arrest, imprison, and execute suspected enemies of the state without trial, creating a climate of fear where ordinary Germans feared speaking out against the regime. Through this systematic control, Evans argues, Nazi Germany became a totalitarian state where every institution served the regime, opposition was crushed, and ordinary citizens were conditioned to obey and conform. Dissent was nearly impossible, as people feared both state surveillance and denunciation by neighbors, colleagues, or even family members. By the mid-1930s, the Nazis had completed their transformation of German society, ensuring absolute control over the nation. Chapter 10. The Racial State. With political control firmly in place, Hitler moved forward with a central component of Nazi ideology, the creation of a racially pure society. Evans highlights that Nazi racial policies were not simply extreme nationalism, but a systematic and state-driven attempt to define, segregate, and ultimately eliminate groups deemed undesirable. The most infamous racial laws were the Nuremberg Laws, passed in 1935, which formalized anti-Semitic policies into German law. These laws stripped German Jews of their citizenship, banning them from voting, holding public office, or marrying non-Jewish Germans. Jews were increasingly segregated from public life, barred from schools, certain professions, and public spaces. The Nuremberg Laws legitimized institutionalized discrimination, setting the stage for further persecution. However, Evans notes that Nazi racial ideology extended beyond anti-Semitism. The regime targeted other social and ethnic groups, including Roma, Gypsies, disabled individuals, LGBTQ+ people, and political dissidents. The Nazis saw these groups as threats to the purity and strength of the German race, implementing policies to isolate, sterilize, or eliminate them. One of the first and most horrifying programs was the T4 euthanasia program, where the Nazis sterilized and later killed thousands of disabled people they saw as unfit to live. Doctors and hospitals helped, following the Nazi idea that the government could choose who could live and have children. By the late 1930s, Nazi racial policies were part of everyday life in Germany. Schools taught that some races were superior, and doctors carried out forced sterilizations. The Nazis treated Jews and other targeted groups as less than human, setting the stage for the Holocaust. Evans explains that Nazi racial policies were not just Hitler's ideas. Many government officials, doctors, and regular people supported and enforced them. These ideas became a key part of the government, leading to mass violence and genocide. By this time, Germany was a racial state, where a person's rights and even their life depended on Nazi beliefs about race. Conclusion: How Germany fell to Nazism. By the late 1930s, Germany had been completely transformed into a totalitarian Nazi state, where every aspect of life was controlled by Hitler's regime. Evans emphasizes that this shift did not happen overnight. It was a gradual process, shaped by political failures, social adaptation, and widespread complicity. The Nazi dictatorship was not the result of a sudden coup, but rather the product of years of institutional erosion, propaganda, repression, and public acceptance. One of Evans' key arguments is that Hitler's rise was not simply forced upon Germany. Rather, German society adjusted to Nazism step by step. In the early years, many Germans viewed the Nazis as a necessary force to restore order after the instability of the Weimar Republic. Economic recovery under Hitler, particularly through rearmament and public works programs, won him further support. The persecution of Jews and other marginalized groups was not only tolerated, but often encouraged, as Nazi propaganda had successfully framed them as enemies of the state. The failure of the Weimar Republic played a crucial role in this transformation. Its democratic institutions were weak, its leaders were unable to handle the Great Depression, and its political system was fractured by extremism. When conservative elites helped bring Hitler to power in 1933, they believed they could control him, but instead, he dismantled democracy from within. The Reichstag Fire Decree and Enabling Act allowed Hitler to crush political opposition legally, while organizations like the Gestapo and SS ensured fear and obedience. By the time Hitler declared himself Führer in 1934, most Germans had already been conditioned to accept a one-party dictatorship. The state-controlled media, Nazi education system, and suppression of dissent left little room for resistance. Evans highlights how many ordinary Germans participated in the Nazi system, whether by denouncing neighbors, benefiting from Aryanization policies that stole Jewish property, or joining organizations like the Hitler Youth. While some resisted, the majority either supported the regime or chose to remain silent. The ultimate test of Nazi power came on September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, officially starting World War II. This act of aggression was not a sudden decision, but the culmination of years of militarization, expansionist rhetoric, and the dismantling of international agreements. Hitler had already reoccupied the Rhineland, annexed Austria, and taken over Czechoslovakia without significant resistance from Western powers. When Germany launched its attack on Poland, it was clear that Hitler's vision extended beyond dictatorship. He was preparing for war and conquest. Evans concludes that the Nazi state was not built solely by Hitler, but by a society that adapted to and enabled his rule. The erosion of democracy, the manipulation of public opinion, and the gradual escalation of violence all paved the way for dictatorship and war. Germany did not fall to Nazism in a single moment. It slid into it, step by step, until there was no turning back. Finalizing the coming of the Third Reich, Evans presents a compelling and sobering analysis of how Germany succumbed to Nazism. His key messages resonate far beyond the historical context, serving as a cautionary examination of democracy's vulnerabilities and the forces that can erode it. The Nazis did not seize power by force. German society, in various ways, enabled their rise. Hitler's ascent was not the result of a sudden coup, but a gradual surrender of democratic norms and institutions, facilitated by political elites, media, law enforcement, and an electorate desperate for stability. Many Germans, whether through active support, passive compliance, or fear, contributed to the dismantling of democracy, demonstrating that authoritarianism thrives not only on coercion, but also on acquiescence. The failures of the Weimar Republic and economic collapse created the perfect storm for extremism. Weimar democracy was fragile from its inception, plagued by institutional instability, weak leadership, and deep societal divisions. The Great Depression amplified public disillusionment, fueling radicalization and allowing extremist movements like the Nazis to position themselves as the only viable alternative. Conservative elites, believing they could manipulate Hitler for their own ends, fatally underestimated his capacity for consolidating absolute power. Democracy is not self-sustaining. Without vigilance and commitment, it can erode from within. The fall of the Weimar Republic is a stark reminder that democratic systems are only as strong as the willingness of their citizens to defend them. The Nazis exploited legal mechanisms to dismantle democracy step by step, illustrating how authoritarianism often emerges through existing institutions rather than through sudden overthrow. Evans warns that complacency, indifference, and the prioritization of order over liberty can pave the way for the gradual collapse of democratic governance. Ultimately, the coming of the Third Reich is more than a history of Nazi Germany. It is a profound study of how modern societies can descend into dictatorship, not in a single moment, but through a series of small, seemingly justifiable concessions. It is a warning that history does not simply repeat itself, but that its lessons remain deeply relevant whenever democracy is taken for granted. Thank you for your time and thoughtful engagement. If you have any reflections, insights, or topics you'd like to explore further, we'd love to hear from you. We look forward to seeing you again for our next book discussion. If you enjoyed this content, your support through a subscription and a like is truly appreciated. Until next time, thank you.